Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the November 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and in it we'll be continuing our Homeless Industrial Complex syllabus readings with The National Union of the Homeless, A Brief History by the Homeless Union History Project of the Poverty Scholars Program. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was written and designed by Emily McNeil, coordinated and edited by Crystal Hall, and produced by the Homeless Union History Project of the Poverty Scholars Program, povertyinitiative.org, July 2011. It begins with the National Union of the Homeless mission statement from May 1988. The heart and soul of the National Union of the Homeless is to commit our lives to ending the oppression of all homeless people and work tirelessly for economic justice, human rights, and full liberation. We dedicate ourselves to transmitting our awareness of our sisters and brothers, to planning a sustained struggle, and to building an organization that can obtain freedom through revolutionary perseverance. We pledge to deepen our personal commitment to end all forms of exploitation, racism, sexism, and abuse. True solidarity demands that we create not only the new society, but also the new human being. And now the text. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the United States economy underwent a series of changes that led to a sharp rise in homelessness. Homelessness was no longer characterized by down-and-out individuals living on skid rows. For the first time in U.S. history, families were increasingly becoming homeless, and the shelter system was created to house them. Out of this common experience of dislocation and dispossession grew a national organization of homeless people that mobilized thousands throughout the United States in the 1980s and 1990s. At its height, the National Union of the Homeless, NUH, had over 20 local chapters and 15,000 members in cities across the U.S. Most importantly, it implemented a model of organizing involving the poor and homeless thinking for themselves, speaking for themselves, fighting for themselves, and producing from their ranks capable and creative leaders. This was contrary to the prevailing stereotypes and misconceptions about homelessness. Almost 20 years after the decline of the NUH, its history offers important lessons for building a movement to end poverty today, in the midst of continuing concentration of wealth among a few and expanding poverty for many. And there's a picture there of NUH leaders Ron Casanova and Leona Smith at the Housing Now rally in Washington, D.C., 1989. Economic and historical context. The NUH emerged during a period of increasing poverty and inequality due to significant changes in the structure of the U.S. economy. Through the 1970s, the U.S. economy was shaken as a result of competition from reconstructed Japan and Europe, stagflation, rising oil prices, and the end of fixed exchange rates, which weakened the dollar. Quick comment there, reconstructed from what? Reconstructed from World War II. The U.S. after World War II was able to enjoy several decades of near-complete dominance, having emerged relatively unscathed and with a huge, well-oiled, fired-up industrial machine that previously had been used for the war effort, and then after the war was used both to continue the United States military and economic dominance. Continuing. These factors coincided with unprecedented deindustrialization, downsizing of middle-income jobs, and the rising popularity of neoliberalism among the economic and political elite. Neoliberal policies, first implemented under the CIA-backed Pinochet regime in Chile, were pursued in the 1980s by President Ronald Reagan and UK Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. Reflecting major shifts in the structure of the economy, these policies included large cuts in public spending, accompanied by tax cuts, deregulation of the banking industry and the financial markets, and anti-union policies. Comment, we speak broadly of three major periods of capitalism in the United States to date. First, the classical liberal period, the original free market capitalism, which culminated in the late 19th century robber baron and Gilded Age period into the early 20th century, followed by social democracy. This is when free market capitalism was restrained somewhat, public programs were introduced. This was driven by a variety of influences, not the least of which was a domestic labor and socialist, communist, general radical movement and the international communist movement, which had had major success setting up the USSR. And this, of course, scared the crap out of the capitalists. So there were many pressures which led to this period of class peace in the United States, class peace being in quotes there, where the capitalists were still in power. They had not been overthrown. However, there were major concessions given, workers' rights, again, public programs, things like Social Security, a formalized system for negotiating labor disputes and recognizing union rights, and so on. This lasted for a number of decades in the mid-20th century. Then, third, neoliberalism, when this was torn down, and it was something of a return to the original classical free market capitalism. However, the economy, capital tends to consolidate over time, so production under capitalism had changed somewhat. However, reverting to those early principles of defunding and shrinking public programs wherever possible, privatizing everything that could be privatized, and then deregulating everything in the private sector that they could deregulate. We're now several decades into this neoliberal period, and the effects have been horrific for working people. Continuing. Affordable housing in the U.S. was hit particularly hard during this period. Gentrification pushed families out of city neighborhoods as the government decimated funding for public housing. From 1981 to 1988, the Department of Housing and Urban Development's budget was cut from $32.3 billion to $7.5 billion. Rising commodity prices and dwindling job opportunities, combined with severe cutbacks in social services, saw the beginnings of the breakdown of the so-called middle class into the newly impoverished. The NUH's slogan, "You are only one paycheck away from homelessness," was true for more Americans than ever before. Also on this page, we have a graphic, the organizational history of the National Union of the Homeless, starting with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People program. And then the chart is non-linear, so it's a bit hard to narrate, but some of the other organizations mentioned on here that had some overlap with or led to the creation of the National Union of the Homeless included the National Welfare Rights Organization, the National Welfare Rights Union, the National Anti-Hunger Coalition, the United Electrical Workers Labor Union, the Committee for Dignity and Fairness for the Homeless, Empty the Shelters, Leadership Organizing and Training Institute for Homeless Activists, Dignity Housing, Dignity Tenants Leadership Development Institute, the Annie Smart Leadership Development Institute, the Employment Project, and the Women's Institute for New Growth and Support. On the next page, there's another graphic titled Chapters of the National Union of the Homeless, 1986 to 1993. There's a map of the United States and a number of stars for the cities where there were chapters, starting in California, Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, then Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, Colorado, Houston, Kansas City, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Detroit, New Orleans, Mobile, Atlanta, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Camden, Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Next section, the rise of the National Union of the Homeless. The NUH had its roots in Philadelphia. In 1983, Chris Sproul, Tex Howard, and Franklin Smith, all of whom had been unemployed and homeless for over a year, founded the Committee for Dignity and Fairness for the Homeless. Within 9 months, they had over 500 homeless members. In 1984, the group opened a shelter run by the homeless and formerly homeless, the first of many projects of survival that would become a key component of the NUH's organizing strategy. In April 1985, the Committee for Dignity and Fairness held the founding convention of the Philadelphia Delaware Valley Union of the Homeless. The meeting brought together over 400 homeless delegates, union leaders, religious leaders, lawyers, and politicians. They developed a constitution expressing a commitment to collective action for the rights of the poor and homeless, uniting across race, gender, sexual orientation, age, religion, national origin, and political affiliation. The group won a series of early victories, including the right to shelter, 24-hour intake in public shelters, the right of homeless to vote, and public showers. The Philadelphia Delaware Valley Union of the Homeless quickly grew to 6,000 dues-paying members supporting their work. And there's a picture of Savina Martin, president of the Greater Boston Union of the Homeless. By the mid-1980s, the NUH began to expand nationally. The Leadership and Organizing Training Institute for Homeless Activists, a 6-week intensive program based in Philadelphia, graduated leaders from around the country for the purpose of carrying out a national organizing drive. In the winter offensive of 1986, organizers began traveling around the country to help build affiliate chapters. Groups in Los Angeles, Chicago, New Orleans, New York, and Boston all acquired bases of operation. Chapters also started in Oakland, Tucson, Albuquerque, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Detroit over the following year. By 1993, affiliates had also formed in Baltimore, Camden, Atlanta, Mobile, Houston, Phoenix, Kansas City, Colorado, and San Francisco. Parallel to many of these local NUH chapters emerged chapters of Empty the Shelters, Fill the Homes, an ally student organization of the NUH. And there is a picture of the logo of Empty the Shelters. A major effort of this period was the 1988 Take Off the Boards campaign, in which takeovers of vacant houses were coordinated in 73 cities. In the summer of 1989, a survival summit was convened by the NUH, the National Welfare Rights Union, the National Anti-Hunger Coalition, and the United Electrical Workers, District 1. The slogan, "Up and Out of Poverty Now," was adopted. Nationally, the NUH prioritized the demands for permanent, suitable housing, as well as decent jobs and job training. You can see there a poster for the Skylight Pictures documentary Takeover, which was about this. In October 1989, NUH participated in a massive Housing Now march on Washington, D.C., along with the National Coalition for the Homeless, the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and the Center for Creative Nonviolence, among other groups. The NUH, under the leadership of Ron Casanova of the Tompkins Square Park Union of the Homeless, led a 400-mile exodus march from New England and New York to merge into the Housing Now protest, and the first National Homeless Convention, also being held in Washington, D.C. Despite being marginalized by advocacy organizations involved in planning the action, NUH representatives managed to get a meeting with Jack Kemp, the head of HUD. Kemp agreed to make 10,000 HUD units available to the homeless over the next year, a major victory. However, Kemp did not keep his word and stopped communicating with NUH representatives, instead negotiating with representatives from advocacy groups Center for Creative Nonviolence and National Low-Income Housing Coalition. In response to HUD's backtracking, NUH launched one of its most successful actions, a coordinated takeover of abandoned HUD buildings in 7 cities. The takeovers, which took place on May 1, 1990, in New York, Minneapolis, Detroit, Los Angeles, Tucson, Oakland, Chicago, and Philadelphia, were documented by Pamela Yates and Peter Kenoy of Skylight Pictures. The action was a success on many fronts. In Oakland, publicity about the takeovers pressured the city government to provide $2 million in land for the construction of Dignity Housing West. In Minneapolis, activists took over 15 buildings and the city government conceded millions for a homeless-run housing program. In Philadelphia, the mayor refused to evict homeless families from HUD properties. In addition, NUH's collaboration with Skylight Pictures produced the full-length film Takeover, telling the story of the takeovers from the organizers' perspective. NUH's organizing model. The National Union of the Homeless used what was called a Johnny Tillman model of organizing, named for the Watts welfare mother who was the first chair of the National Welfare Rights Organization. This model was based on 2 central principles. 1. Poverty victims must be at the forefront of the movement to end poverty. And 2. You only get what you're organized to take. Stemming from these principles, the NUH stressed 5 interdependent ingredients of organizing. These included 1. Teams of organizers identifying and organizing around issues on which people are prepared to act. 2. Bases of operation often associated with projects of survival. 3. Mutual support networks, with wide-ranging organizations of poor folks and allies. 2. Internal and external lines of communication. And 5. Nationally connected leaders, educated and trained in political consciousness and strategy, able to unite diverse but related struggles. And there's a picture there, study, understand, and expose the enemy. The demise of the National Union of the Homeless. The NUH began to face serious challenges in the early 1990s. The crack cocaine epidemic that swept through American cities, beginning in the 1980s, hit the leadership of the NUH hard. A number of major leaders left due to struggles with addiction. At the same time, some of NUH's major successes caused divisions within the organization. Dignity housing programs in Philadelphia and Oakland, for example, acquired large grants, but disagreements arose regarding what concessions would be made in order to win funds. Some of NUH's hard-won victories appeared in danger of being co-opted by politicians and funders. Ultimately, the National Union of the Homeless did not survive the stresses of the drug epidemic and co-optation intact. One of the major lessons of the NUH experience was the need for a clear, committed, competent, and connected core of leaders. These leaders must be systematically educated and trained if such an organizing effort is to be maintained and able to overcome pressures towards compromise and co-optation of its basic goals and principles. And there's a picture there, Voices from the Front, Up and Out of Poverty Now campaign. Caption, Voices from the Front was a newsletter of NUH's Up and Out of Poverty Now campaign, including news from the movement, poetry, and art. The legacy of the National Union of the Homeless. Although the NUH went into decline in the early 1990s, a number of its leaders continued organizing for social and economic human rights. The NUH's mission and methods were further developed and carried on through other organizations, including the Kensington Welfare Rights Union, the Poor People's Economic Human Rights Campaign, the University of the Poor, and many others. The development of a number of the leaders of the Poverty Scholars Network dates back to the founding and struggle of the NUH. The Poverty Scholars Program is a leadership development, technical assistance, and skills training program for low-income organizers from grassroots organizations nationwide working on issues of economic justice. The Homeless Union History Project is part of the leadership development process of the Poverty Scholars Program. This work-study project documents the history of the homeless union, conducts research, and develops curriculum for political education. Its research methodology and curriculum production is informed by the political education and organizational development needs of the Poverty Scholars Program's growing network of anti-poverty organizations. The purpose of this process is to develop leaders with a collective understanding and analysis of this history for the purpose of building a powerful, broad-based social movement to end poverty, led by the poor as a united and organized social force. There's a graphic there, the historical tree of the National Union of the Homeless, with a number of different organizations listed. So that's the end of the pamphlet. Before the acknowledgments, there is a timeline of the National Union of the Homeless. 1983, Chris Sproul, Tex Howard, and Franklin Smith found the Committee for Dignity and Fairness for the Homeless in Philadelphia. In 1984, February, Sproul, Howard, and Smith established a shelter run and managed by currently and formerly homeless people. In 1985, on April 6, was the founding convention of the Philadelphia Delaware Valley Union of the Homeless, where its constitution is adopted. Later that year, the Philadelphia Delaware Valley Union wins the rights to shelter, 24-hour shelter intake, voting for homeless persons, and public showers. Also, the beginning of the effort to build a national network of chapters. In 1986, the Leadership and Organizing Training Institute for Homeless Activists was developed. In October, NUH held its first national strategy meeting and elected officers. Then, the Winter Offensive Strategy involved calls for simultaneous actions among affiliates under the slogan, Homes and Jobs, Not Death in the Streets. Also, chapters and affiliate unions were established in Los Angeles, Chicago, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. In 1987, affiliate unions were established in Oakland, Tucson, Albuquerque, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Detroit. Also, the Stuart McKinney Homeless Assistance Act secured funding for emergency shelters as the Reagan administration drastically cut the HUD budget. In October, the National Tribunal on the Plight of the Homeless was held in New York City, and the founding convention of the New York Homeless Union found 1,200 delegates assembling at the Riverside Church. In 1988, Dignity Housing was incorporated by Sproul, Leona Smith, and Alicia Christian. In May, the new executive board members of the NUH drafted their mission statement. In July was the Take Off the Boards campaign. In 1989, July, NUH leaders, including Willie Baptist and Leona Smith, visit Tompkins Square Park, Tent City, and meet with Ron Casanova. Also in July, the Survival Summit convened in Philadelphia. Chapters of the NUH, National Welfare Rights Union, and National Anti-Hunger Coalition attended. The Up and Out of Poverty Now slogan was adopted. Then the Exodus March. Ron Casanova and the Tompkins Square Park Union of the Homeless lead almost 300 members of NUH and allied groups to Washington, D.C. On October 7th, the Housing Now rally was held in Washington, D.C., attended by 100,000 people. And Leona Smith was elected president of NUH after Chris Sproul admitted his drug addiction. In 1990, May 1st, NUH coordinates the takeovers of empty federally owned houses in New York, Minneapolis, Detroit, Los Angeles, Tucson, Oakland, Chicago, and Philadelphia. So you can see there between 1983, the beginning of this, to 1990, really a lot happened. And then, of course, there were earlier struggles for civil and economic rights that, of course, influenced this and served as a model for it. So, acknowledgments. This pamphlet is a part of the research process of the Homeless Union History Project of the Poverty Scholars Program. Thanks to Chris Caruso, Sharon Hrybar, and Dan Jones for their foundational roles in building this collectivity. Thanks especially to Willie Baptist for his invaluable insight into the homeless union experience. As far as additional resources, this pamphlet recommends for books and articles Willie Baptist and Jan Raymond's Pedagogy of the Poor, New York Teachers College Press 2011, Ron Casanova's Each One Teach One, Curbstone Press, Willimantic, Connecticut, 1996, Chris Grove's Impoverishment and Social Struggle Under U.S. Neoliberalism, The National Union of the Homeless, from 2008. That one's unpublished, might be hard to find. For videos, the New York City Homeless Union / Culture Club, Homeless, Not Helpless, New York, 1987. Skylight Pictures, Living Broke in Boom Times, Lessons from the Movement to End Poverty, produced by Dara Kell and Paco Deonis, New York, 2007. Also Skylight Pictures Takeover, produced by Peter Kenoy and Pamela Yates, New York, 1990. And the Survival Summit, Up and Out of Poverty Now campaign, Street Heat, Philadelphia, 1989. Online, the Homeless Union History Project, homelessunion.wiki.com. Please contact us at poverty@povertyinitiative.org.